Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's Harriman Institute webinar book talk. My name is Alex Cooley. I'm the current director of the Harriman Institute, professor of political science at Barnard College. And welcome to all of you who are coming in through Zoom and through YouTube, as well as those watching this on recording. Today's a very special event in that we are celebrating with the author of this wonderful new book, The Daughters of Yalta, the Churchills, Roosevelts, and Harrimans, a story of love and war by Catherine Grace Katz. And the book itself not only covers a really important episode and moment in the history of our region, the Yalta Conference, but also features prominently a member of literally and figuratively the Harriman family. And so this is a really fascinating account. And just to give you a little bit of information about Catherine, she's a writer and historian from Chicago, having graduated Harvard with a BA in history and received an MPhil in modern European history from the University of Cambridge. After working in finance in New York City, she had a very fortuitous visit to the bookstore in the lobby of her office in Manhattan, which led her to return to history and writing. Maybe she can talk about that a little bit. And so Daughters of Yalta is her first book. It's been widely reviewed in outlets like New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and she's currently pursuing her JD at Harvard Law School. So Catherine, welcome again. Congratulations on the book. It's wonderful to have you here. And we'd love to hear a little bit about what in the world motivated you to delve into this topic. Yalta, as I learned it, and I think a lot of others, is a kind of the seminal geopolitical turning point where you have, big negotiations and plans being drawn out for, the future of the UN and Poland and the partition of Germany and so forth. And yet you managed to find a much different dimension to this. So we'd love to hear about that. And again, thanks so much for joining us.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and thank you to everyone who's tuning in today. I really appreciate it, and it's great fun not only to talk with you, but specifically because it is the Harriman Institute. I love all of the personal connections that are part of this book, and it really was a very personal experience for me. I didn't set out and say, I want to write a book about the Yalta Conference. It kind of just came together in a very, very fortuitous way. As you mentioned a few minutes ago, I'd studied history at Harvard and Cambridge and had spent a lot of time studying Winston Churchill, but actually not Churchill as prime minister. Was looking at Churchill's escape from a Boer POW camp during the Boer War, and then his time as the Home Secretary during the First World War. And after I graduated from Cambridge, I did what I think many recent grads do. They feel like they should do the smart thing. And so I went to work in finance in New York. And by coincidence, in the lobby of my office was this bookstore called Chartwell Booksellers, which was named after Churchill's country home. And as soon as I learned that this bookstore was there, I couldn't stop myself but continuously go in. I'd say I was going to get a coffee kind of when I needed a break from Excel modeling, and then would go downstairs and just go into the bookstore and try to re-engage with history. And I think that the owner was a little bit amused that I kept coming in. He didn't have too many younger women who were patrons of his store. And so I got to know him after many of these visits, and he very kindly introduced me to the International Churchill Society, which is made up of academics and professionals who want to encourage people to study history and Churchill's leadership and encourage people to go into public service, but also members of the Churchill family. And they were opening the papers of Sarah Churchill, Winston's middle daughter, to outside researchers for the first time. And they asked if I was interested in writing an article about them for their magazine. And I said, yes, of course. I thought this was a great chance to continue to re-engage with history. And I always wanted to be a writer. I just didn't think that I'd be able to do that in my 20s. And so I had this chance to see Sarah's papers and write an article about them. And I became fascinated by her wartime experience. Some people know her as an actress. She starred in a movie with Fred Astaire called Royal Wedding. but people don't really know what she did during the war, which was incredible. She had been a member of the women's branch of the Royal Air Force and had accompanied her father as his aide to both the Tehran and Yalta conferences. And inspired by her example and how useful and supportive she was to her father at Tehran, both FDR and Averil Harriman decided to bring their daughters to Yalta as well. And so through the Churchill family, I got to meet Kathleen Harriman's family, and then also got to meet Anna Roosevelt's family. And it just kind of was, one thing led to another. And before I knew it, I knew that this was a great story that needed to be told, and I couldn't wait to write the book.
Oh, it's terrific. So take us, I know you've prepared some slides and some visuals about Yalta and the convening of this conference. So, take us through some of the background setting here.
Sure. So I'm just going to share my screen quickly and show a couple of pictures, set the stage. So I just want to start with this one, which I think is, the very famous picture of the Yalta Conference that most people are familiar with. And you can see the big three. They're in the courtyard of Lavadia Palace on February 8th, 1945. Behind them are their military advisors. And you can see the very grim expressions on their faces. And, they're exhausted at this point in the war, just to kind of mark time. The Battle of the Bulge has just ended. Iwo Jima has not yet happened. It looks like the war in Europe is going to be over by the spring, summer. The race is on to liberate Berlin. But the Pacific War is, not anywhere close to being over. They don't yet know if the atomic bomb is going to be a success. And so the big three meet at Yalta to discuss a wide array of topics, but I think kind of four of them are the most important and the ones that are really weighing on them at this moment. And first is what to do about Germany in the post-war period. Should they be allowed to remain one nation, or should they be broken up into smaller states in hopes that they won't rise up as a belligerent again? Also incredibly important was the issue of Polish sovereignty. Britain had gone to war at the outset to defend Polish sovereignty, and now the Soviet Union with the Red Army had boots on the ground across Eastern Europe. And so there's a very delicate balance here of trying not to alienate the Soviets, whose cooperation the Western allies still need, but trying desperately to secure the independence for Poland that they had gone to protect at the beginning of the war. Then very importantly for FDR was the war in the Pacific. Again, as I mentioned, they don't yet know if the atomic bomb is going to work. So he's looking at a potential invasion of the Japanese home islands, which could lead to the deaths of 200,000 American soldiers. And so he wants to bring the Soviet Union into the war in the Pacific in exchange for territorial concessions. And finally, there's the matter of the founding of the United Nations. They'd begun talks about the UN the previous summer. Roosevelt really wants to succeed where Woodrow Wilson failed at the end of World War I, and he believes that the best way to bring the Soviet Union into the international community once the common enemy has been defeated is through an international peace institution like the United Nations. And so this is incredibly important specifically to Roosevelt. But what I found really interesting as I began to do my research on this is that there's another photograph of almost exactly the same scene, but taken from a slightly different perspective. And in it, you can see two of the three daughters standing off to the side. You can see Sarah Churchill and Kathleen Harriman. And this is a photo that people don't really see too often. I had never seen it before, and I'd studied Yalta on numerous occasions as a student of history. And I just thought it was remarkable that of all the people that these leaders could have brought with them to the Yalta Conference as their aides, they chose their daughters. And that said to me that there's something really important about these relationships between the fathers and daughters that we had missed, and that I wanted to know more about. And you can see a picture of the three daughters together at Yalta here. See Sarah Churchill in her Women's Auxiliary Air Force uniform. Anna Roosevelt is in the middle. Kathleen Harriman's on the end. Sarah is 30, Anna is 38, and she's a mother of three, and Kathleen is 27. I was 27 while I was doing most of the research and writing of this book, and I just was thinking, what would it be like to be 27 years old, like Kathleen Harriman, and to be there in this environment? And I think what people also don't realize is just what it took to get to Yalta. And this is something that became very important when I was writing the book, that I wanted to share with people just how much of a challenge it was to physically get there. At this point in the war, Roosevelt and Churchill need Stalin more than he needs them. And so they are willing to go all the way to the Crimea to meet with Stalin. That's the farthest west that he will come. He says it's because his doctors won't allow him to go any further, which is kind of ironic given that Roosevelt was the one who was in poor health at the time. And so Churchill has to fly 1,300 miles first to Malta, where he rendezvous with Roosevelt, who's traveled across the Atlantic Ocean, where they're still sighting U-boats. They meet at Malta, where it's kind of led to the apocryphal quip from Stalin, "I said Yalta, not Malta." And then they have to fly over enemy-occupied territory where they're still getting shot at in their low-altitude, unpressurized planes. They land in the Crimea at this airfield that is not at all equipped to handle the kinds of planes that they're landing, drive a further 6 hours over battle-scarred roads, and then finally to Levadia Palace, where they're holding the conference, which on the outside looks like this beautiful, it's the Tsar's former summer palace. And so it is a beautiful place, but it is really a shell of former glories, because the Nazis had been using Levadia as their Crimean headquarters for the last few years. And when they left, they stripped it of everything that they could carry: the furniture, the art, the china, even down to the doorknobs. And so once they agree that they'll meet at Yalta, the Soviets have just 3 weeks to turn around what has been this really kind of decrepit palace into something that is the site of one of these incredible conferences. So they have to restock it with everything they can find from some of the luxurious hotels in Moscow, and just requisition items like ashtrays and coat hangers out of homes. And so it really is kind of this juxtaposition between the splendor on the outside, but the really horrible conditions that they all agreed to put up with, if you look a little closer.
So I found that I have a ton of questions, but I found that part, your attention to just the kind of the built environment details, to be absolutely fascinating. And could you say a little bit more about why that was important to you, and what kinds of sort of psychological pressures or background atmosphere do you think these conditions generated over the course of that week?
Sure. I think that the sense of place in this story, it's almost as if Yalta is a character in the story itself. It has such a palpable tension that surrounds it. This is a place that's very beautiful. It looks like the Italian coast. It could be a Mediterranean resort, and it was the resort retreat of the Romanovs and their friends. The stretch is called the Romanov Route. But it had been really kind of defiled in a way after the Russian Revolution. The Soviets take it over to turn the place into this home for Soviet workers, and then of course the Nazis take it over as their Crimean headquarters. And so this place it's in terrible shape, and it's just amazing to think that when you think of the summits that take place today, they're planned out a year in advance, and every attention to detail is made, and it's all the concerns about security, and there really is none of that here. And so they're willing to go into this somewhat blindly, where it's just kind of this slap together, yes, we're going to try to make this as nice as possible. And the Soviets, they should be applauded for what they did. But then on the other hand, there's still bed bugs and other bugs, the Russian variety, listening in on what everyone's saying. And the gardens have been tended and groomed, but they've been groomed in such a way such that Roosevelt, in his wheelchair, will be able to take certain paths. And so they bug those paths too. And so it's kind of that duality of, the environment working for the Soviets as well. And then just things like, there are like barely any bathrooms in these palaces. And you've got hundreds of people who are here, at Levadia, where the Americans are staying, and then Vorontsov Palace, where the British are staying. And you have these very, very long lines in the morning where generals and admirals are queuing to use the bathroom and they can't get in. So they're having these impromptu meetings in the hallways. They're sending their aides out to hold their place in line. It's just kind of, you think these people who should have only the finest suites at the Dorchester or the Savoy Hotel, and they're kind of willing to put up with these conditions for the sake of having this in-person meeting, just really also stresses the importance of in-person diplomacy at this time in the war. And I think overall in kind of the diplomatic world.
Yeah, no, the attention to detail that you draw out is really fascinating. I guess one obvious question here is, why did these three men choose to bring these remarkable daughters to Yalta, and why were they their chosen confidants, as opposed to, say, their advisors, or even brothers, if you want to sort of talk about the families? What was it here?
Yeah, so I'll start with Sarah Churchill, since my research started with her. And Sarah had a number of talents and just her life experience lent very well to being an aide-de-camp at one of these conferences. She and her father had had a very close relationship since she was a little girl, and she felt like she understood her father's mind better than anyone. She was really shy as a child, but felt just implicitly she knew the way that her father thought and that she could walk in silent step with him, as she said, and really knew the way he worked better than anyone, except for perhaps her mother, Clementine. And also early in the war, the Churchill family had decided that when Winston traveled abroad, that someone from the family should go with him as a confidant and protector, and also as a kind of unofficial family historian, because they knew that Winston would want to write his war memoirs later. And Sarah was an incredibly beautiful writer. You can really hear her father's voice in her, and she had a very astute grasp of politics. And I believe that if she had been born 10 years later, perhaps she could have succeeded her father in politics. That's how much of a gift she had for it. And then combined also with her experience as an officer in the women's branch of the RAF, where she knew the very technical details of Allied operations, especially in the Mediterranean, which had been her focus as an intelligence officer. And then also her experience as an actress, which lent herself extremely well to diplomacy, where so much of it is kind of you're putting on this show where there are multi-layered conversations, and you can saying something with a smile but really means something else. And for all these reasons, she's kind of the perfect choice to go with her father to these conferences. That's why he chooses her at Tehran, and while the other two fathers then are inspired by her example to bring their daughters. Kathleen Harriman also had some very specific technical abilities that made her very valuable to Averil Harriman. She and her father did not have a super close relationship when she was a child. Her parents had divorced when she was a little girl, and so it was only after her mother died when she was a teenager that she and her father became closer, really through their shared love of adventure and sport. He was somewhat ahead of his time in inviting his daughters into his professional life to the extent that they wanted to be involved and really encouraged them to be. And so Kathleen spent her school vacations with him in Sun Valley, the ski resort that he had founded to bring people out west using Union Pacific Railroad, of which he was chairman. And so she assisted him at Sun Valley, where they kind of developed this working relationship where they really became more like colleagues in a way than parent and child. And when he became Roosevelt's Lend-Lease envoy in London in 1941, he thought it would be a great opportunity for Kathleen to come with him and work as a war reporter during the Blitz. And she thinks this is going to be a great adventure and a remarkable life experience. And so she goes with him, and they further this relationship and become very close friends with the Churchill family. And then when he becomes the ambassador to the Soviet Union in 1943, she goes with him, decides to learn Russian for both of them, and really kind of becomes his assistant ambassador and becomes the American woman who has more access to and experience with Stalin's inner circle than any American woman in history, which is just remarkable to think this young woman in her 20s coming of age in that kind of environment. So her technical skills and her experience working with him in Moscow over the last few years is very, very valuable. And then finally, Anna Roosevelt, even though she is the oldest of the three daughters, she is the least experienced in kind of the realm of foreign policy. She had always hoped to travel with her father to his conferences abroad during the war, but he had always resisted and instead had brought his sons who could physically support him to stand, to move, and he really relied on them. But at this time in his life, something has changed, and he and Anna were close when she was a little girl, but after his paralysis, their relationship became much more distant. And it's not until World War II, when Anna had been living in Seattle with her husband and children, and she and her husband were the editors of the Seattle Post-Intelligencer newspaper, that her husband joins the army, and so she decides to move home. And while she's there, she realizes that something about her father has changed. He seems to be in poor health, and no one has noticed except for her. Even Eleanor really seems to be in denial that something has changed, and Anna insists that he have a comprehensive medical examination, which reveals he has congestive heart failure. And no one other than the cardiologist and Anna knows just how sick he is. Even Roosevelt doesn't ask what's wrong with him. But clearly he knows something has changed, because he cables Churchill in January 1945 and says, if you're thinking of bringing Sarah to this conference, I'm also considering bringing my daughter Anna. And so he brings Anna with him really to be kind of his protector and gatekeeper. And even though he doesn't know exactly what it is she's protecting him from, he knows that she's doing something very important and has come to rely on her in the year that she'd been living in the White House to play this role for him. And so each of them have, I'd say, similar, but also very unique aspects that make them uniquely valuable to their fathers at this time.
Thanks for that. It's just, absolutely fascinating, that dimension about it. And of course, it's not just the individual daughters and the relationship to these principles. There are also these interrelationships amongst the three families. And you draw quite extensively on the Pamela-Kathleen correspondence. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes. So the families all had these relationships that were very intertwined. And I think this is a perfect example where you can see that the personal and the political are inextricably linked. The Churchill family and the Harriman family had become very close friends while Averil and Kathleen were living in London during the early part of the war, while he was the Lend-Lease envoy and she was working as a war reporter. Averil Harriman was really brought into Churchill's inner circle early on, before the Americans entered the war. And Harriman was a very strong advocate for American entry into the war to fight alongside the British. And so he was really kind of his trusted partner for Churchill and the go-between between Churchill and Roosevelt. So he'd spend many weekends with them at the Prime Minister's country home, Chequers, and Kathleen would also be with him. And so they were even celebrating Kathleen's 24th birthday the night that they learned about Pearl Harbor. So it's kind of funny to think about these seminal moments in the war that they experienced together. So Kathleen and Winston Churchill's daughter-in-law, Pamela, became very good friends. They're about the same age. Pamela's married to Winston's son, Randolph. But as Kathleen soon learns, her father had developed a romantic relationship with Pamela at this time as well, which some people know about. And Pamela was having relationships not just with Harriman, but also with several other prominent Americans. And so she kind of used this deliberately as a power, to make herself more important. And so the relationship between Pamela and Averil lasts during the time that they're in London. And then when he becomes the ambassador to the Soviet Union, he breaks off the affair and kind of asks Kathleen to do it for him. And Kathleen has somewhat accepted the relationship. She, as I said, it is more like a relationship between colleagues in a sense than parent and child. And so she and Pamela are very good friends throughout this. And for Kathleen, it makes her indispensable to Averil. She's not going to be sent home if she's kind of covering up for the relationship. And so there is a voluminous correspondence between Kathleen and Pamela throughout this time. And she's writing a very long letter to her at Yalta of the day by day. But what's also even more interesting about it, beyond the salaciousness, is that there's a very small group of young women who know what it's like to be in this environment and have this shared experience during the war. Kathleen is one, Pamela is one, Sarah Churchill is another one, and they had all known each other during the war, during this time in London. And so it is a unique perspective that really only they can understand. And it's kind of these bonds forged in war that I think are really interesting.
Yeah, no, that's just, a really fascinating part of the book, sort of emphasizing that. And, the other insight that really stands out, and maybe put you a little bit on the spot here, but you tell us that Kathleen is fascinated by Stalin, and that even, you even sort of hint at that she might even have a better understanding of Stalin, that even her father or FDR, despite, their positions and, diplomatic experience, or, this belief in the power of sort of personal relationships. So maybe talk to us a little bit about how Kathleen perceives Stalin, maybe how that evolves over the course of the conference.
Sure. So Kathleen had been working as a war reporter in London, and early on she was given, pretty bottom of the barrel things to cover. Like, she's writing articles like "Girls' Cheery Song," lifts the spirits of the local community. It's kind of like these women's interest pieces. But before long, she proves herself, and she proves that she is quite a good journalist. And so she is given the assignment to cover the press conferences with the exiled European governments that have fled to London at the beginning of the war, namely the Polish government in exile. And so as she's attending these press conferences, what she keeps hearing from them is Stalin is not to be trusted. This is shortly after the Soviet Union has entered the war on the side of the Allies in June 1941. And prior to that, they'd had the non-aggression pact with the Nazis. And so it's kind of already, can they be trusted? And so the message that she's hearing repeatedly, especially from the Poles, is no, you cannot trust him. But at this time, earlier in the war, her father, Averil Harriman, is seeing it kind of through the eyes of a businessman, where he had done business with the Soviet Union throughout the 1920s. He had manganese mines there. He has had these contracts, and says, yes, they may not have the same values that we have, but people still need to do business together. And this is a relationship that will work on a business perspective, from a business perspective, where we have this common enemy. And so he's kind of willing to give Stalin the benefit of the doubt. But however, this begins to change only after he becomes ambassador, and through repeated frustrating dealings with Soviets, especially with the foreign minister Vyacheslav Molotov, and then especially as highlighted after the Warsaw Uprising in the summer of 1944, he comes to realize that Kathleen's early warnings, which she was hearing from the Poles, are a much more accurate view of Stalin. And unfortunately, his warnings then, which he's sharing with Roosevelt, fall on somewhat deaf ears, because Roosevelt is looking at Stalin and the importance of the relationship with them in the post-war world. And he believes that he can form this bond with Stalin through, as he calls it, touchy-feely politics, where, if the two of them like each other, that will be a breakthrough in international relations. And unfortunately, that just really is not quite the case. When he goes to Yalta, Roosevelt brings very few members of the State Department with him. He and Harry Hopkins joke that they're nannies and cookie pushers, and they'll just gum it up in this attempt to forge this personal bond with Stalin, much like the personal bond that he formed with Churchill, which was very genuine. But unfortunately, and you can see kind of in the correspondence between some of the people who would go on to become the wise men of the Cold War, like Chip Bolin, who's there as the Russian ambassador or Russian interpreter for Roosevelt, and George Kennan, who is Harriman's number 2 at the embassy in Moscow. They're communicating with each other. Kennan saying, I don't know why we're bothering with this. We might as well just carve it all up into spheres of influence now and call it a day. And Bolin saying, yes, I agree, this will probably be the outcome, but we at least have an obligation to try. And so, if Roosevelt had consulted them more, if Harriman had listened to Kathleen earlier, maybe things would have been different. There's kind of those unsatisfying counterfactuals that you can go down in a spiral and never get out of.
Oh, that's great. Well, I have a couple more things for you, but we have some really nice questions from the audience, so I want to turn to there next. So one from Russell Gayushev, the legacy of Winston Churchill, Joseph Stalin, and Franklin D. Roosevelt are extensively reevaluated and scrutinized now. Have you changed your mind about them after researching the lives of their daughters, their relationships with their fathers? So that's, nice big issue question to start with.
That's a great question. The thing that most surprised me, I think, and the opinion that most changed, was my assessment of FDR from both as a personally and as a foreign policy strategist. You think of FDR as being a very progressive, very ahead of his time. He certainly valued Eleanor Roosevelt more than any president had valued a first lady. However, when you see some of the private communications and the treatment of his family, it feels a little bit jarring at times to see the way that he, treated Eleanor and Anna kind of behind the scenes. For years, Anna had been begging to go with him and have a chance that her brothers had to travel with him abroad to one of these conferences, and he kept putting her off, saying, no, it's bad luck to have women on ships. You're not in uniform. She's saying, oh, well, I could join the Red Cross, then I'd be in uniform. Or, you're the commander in chief. You can just say it's okay for me to come on a ship. And so there's this communication between Anna and Eleanor in the background, where Anna's saying to her mother, where they're mutually frustrated because Eleanor also wants to come with and he keeps putting her off. And Anna says to her mother, Papa thinks that it's just, the role of the woman to keep the home fires burning. And so you don't think of FDR as, not being as supportive kind of the women closest to him as you might expect, given what FDR and Eleanor Roosevelt are known for. And then on the flip side, I think I was pleasantly surprised to see how supportive and how much value Churchill placed on the women in his life. His wife Clementine was one of his closest advisors. His 3 daughters, Diana, Sarah, and Mary, he was very close with all of them, and actually a surprisingly involved father compared to others of his class and generation. And he did really value their input. He brings Sarah with him instead of Randolph on many occasions, because Randolph, unfortunately, he's brilliant, but doesn't have the same, is kind of a walking liability in many ways, unfortunately. And Mary Churchill, who's quite young at this time, but she does have the chance to go with him to Potsdam, and he really values their contributions. And so you don't think of Churchill as a feminist, but I guess in a sense he was. So I think those are the two most surprising things that I found.
Interesting. Let's next go to a question from Judith Evester. As I recall, a chief Roosevelt advisor and aide died on the way back from Yalta. If so, are there indications that this was an assassination?
I have not seen any indications that it was an assassination, but it is a tragedy. So Pa Watson was one of Roosevelt's, the people closest to Roosevelt. He, like the Roosevelt sons, was also not just an emotional but physical supporter of the president for many years. And it is really tragic. On the way to the conference, the British lose some members of the Foreign Office, again, highlighting just how dangerous it was for them to even be traveling there. A plane full of Foreign Office experts goes down off the coast of Italy on the way, and many of them are killed, especially people who had been specifically briefed for the conference. So they're really losing a lot of institutional memory, and it's so tragic because these are people who've been part of the team for the whole war, and they like many soldiers, lose their lives in the service of their country. And then the Americans suffer a similar loss on the way back with Pa Watson. No, I've never seen any evidence that it was an assassination, although in a somewhat dark humor kind of related to that, when Roosevelt did tragically die 8 weeks after this, Stalin cables Eleanor Roosevelt and says, I think maybe we should have, or I don't know if it was to Eleanor directly, but he cables and says, maybe we should have an autopsy to make sure he wasn't poisoned. Like, that's the first thing that Stalin's mind jumps to. So no, I don't think there was any foul play in the case of Watson. I think it just was, really tragic and terrible luck. But you can see where Stalin's mind goes.
Yeah, yes, indeed. Next question from Tinitin Japaridze, one of our recent distinguished graduates. Such a fascinating topic. Thank you for writing this book. Do we know why and how these men made the decision to bring their daughters to Yalta? Were the decisions made in tandem with one another? If so, is there a reason Stalin was not accompanied by Svetlana? And I have to say, not to put Tinitin on, she's not on camera here, but Tinitin is working on a book on Stalin, or is planning on one. So maybe you two can also talk offline to get some advice about the process there.
Awesome.
But yeah, tell us a little bit about the decisions and whether did they let each other know, and what was Stalin's relationship with his daughter?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, Sarah had been at the Tehran Conference in 1943 as Winston's aide, and it was there that both Harriman and Roosevelt saw how valuable she was, and there was explicit communication between FDR and Churchill in January 1945, where FDR asks if Winston's planning on bringing Sarah again, and if he is, then he's thinking that he might bring Anna. He also thinks that if he brings his daughter instead of his wife, it will be more. There will be less pressure to have kind of some of the formalities around the diplomatic aspects of this conference, having grand banquets, having instead be, shorter banquets and more working time, because you don't have to have quite the same fanfare as if, the first lady comes as well. So that is kind of part of the calculation. So you do see them communicating. And for Kathleen, it really wouldn't be appropriate for her to be there if Anna Roosevelt isn't also there. But she has been at Harriman's side throughout the whole war. And so everybody across the three delegations, the Brits, the Americans, the Russians, they're all really used to Kathleen being part of the group. And she has come to be, her father's assistant ambassador in a sense in Moscow, and really kind of almost like what we'd consider to be a protocol officer at the State Department today, where she's handling a lot of logistics because she speaks Russian, so she can be the liaison between the Soviets and the Americans, and kind of is able to extend her father's reach and influence in a way as well, because they can divide and conquer. He's able to go to the pre-meeting at Malta, leaving her behind in Yalta to handle the arrangements. And because she has the experience with Russian culture, also, she's really valuable in kind of being this bridge, again, between the Americans who are newcomers to this environment and the Harrimans who've been there for such a long time. And so there is certainly a calculation of she can come because Anna is also coming. And she's very excited to meet Anna. They'd never met before. Stalin could have brought his daughter. Svetlana is 19 at the time. She speaks English, and she could have been very valuable, because I really see these daughters as kind of, I call them daughter diplomats, where they're not necessarily official members of the delegation, but they speak with the weight of their fathers behind them. So they're able to go places and have conversations that are off the record, but they can deliver important information or collect important information that they can then relay to their fathers. And so it's this kind of betwixt and between gray area of what is their role, which is actually really valuable and very powerful. And so you can see Svetlana could have played that sort of role as well, but Stalin really didn't allow her to engage with foreigners. There's one instance where Churchill came to Moscow during the war where he does bring Svetlana out before dinner, almost kind of parading her out as if to say, look, I'm a family man too, which is kind of odd and doesn't really ring true with what you think of Stalin. But Svetlana and Stalin had a very bad relationship at this point. She'd learned as a teenager that her mother had committed suicide and was really driven to it by Stalin. And after this, she rebels and has this affair with a much older married man who is a Russian Jewish cinematographer. Stalin then sends this guy to Siberia. Then Svetlana again rebels and she decides to marry one of her classmates, Grigory Morozov, when she's just 19 years old. He's also Jewish. Stalin takes exception to this and refuses to ever meet her husband. And Svetlana is pregnant with her first child at the time. And so their relationship is tumultuous. But she is there in a sense and spirit. After Churchill had visited Moscow, Svetlana had sent a brooch as a gift to Sarah Churchill. They were both redheads, and so I think they had this nice little kind of connection in spirit in a way. And so Sarah actually wears this brooch from Svetlana on her uniform throughout the conference as this nice gesture. And so there is kind of a memory of Svetlana there, but she's not at all involved in her father's professional life or even personally, kind of the way that the other daughters are valued by their fathers.
That's great. So now we have one from Kimberly Hatfield, who wants to know, can you talk about your writing process and how you find time given your many accomplishments? And also, can you recommend other favorite books on Churchill?
Well, thank you. Very nice of you to say. I left my job in finance when I started writing this book, and I had been applying to law school and did not know kind of what the ultimate kind of outcome would be and whether I'd be successful in being able to pitch the book or if the material would be there. So I had applied to law school, and then Harvard kindly allowed me to defer for 2 years to finish the book. So I finished writing it last year while I was in my first year of law school, which was certainly a lot of work. But as I said to many of my friends, I'd rather have no sleep and a book than sleep and no book. So I live to tell the tale. The process of writing this, the research was really great fun. I loved every minute of it. It really was like a treasure hunt in the archives. You never know what you're going to find. And it kind of moved almost daughter by daughter. It started with Sarah Churchill to from writing the article, and then through the Churchills met Kathleen Harriman's family, and then Anna Roosevelt's family. And so I really enjoyed that element of it. The research took about 1.5 years, and the writing took about 1.5 years. And for me, I really kind of saw it almost in set pieces as I was working. There are some significant moments throughout the conference that I kind of saw as landmarks, and then the daughters' kind of commentary between them was also really fascinating. And in the case of, especially Sarah Churchill, her writing was so beautiful. Kathleen's is very energetic. You can kind of see, this young woman coming into her own. And so it's hard not to be a fan of them while also writing about them because they are so engaging. And I also feel that, history has a lot of similarities to kind of the structures of, within biology, where there is like a correct way that everything fits together. And all the puzzle pieces have to, be there, on the bottom layer to be able to build the bigger layers. And it's when you get stuck when you're writing, it's because you're wrong. And you've got something that's out of place, you haven't done enough research, and so you have to go back and do more research and figure out why you're wrong. And every time that happened and I did more research and figured out why, and then it all kind of came together, the financial analyst in me kind of sees it's like this beautiful Excel model that just flows through and everything's nice and all the functions are correct. So that I think was a great lesson also. You kind of get to this point where you're stuck, oh my God, am I going to figure this out? And like, yes, you will, but you need to go do more research. So that was somewhat of what the process was, but I really, truly enjoyed every minute of doing it. It didn't feel like work. And it was, this process of discovery every day where I, was really familiar with Yalta and kind of this, period and transition between World War and Cold War from my time in school. But seeing it from a completely different and much more personal lens was really refreshing as well. And that was something that I wanted to emphasize, kind of the personal side of this story. Yes, it is a story about the Yalta Conference, but above all, it's a story about fathers and daughters at this remarkable moment in history.
Yeah, comes through. Another question we have from the chat is about the ideas and work of Eleanor Roosevelt at this time and how they influenced her in her mission to be one of the individuals who created the UN. Beyond Eleanor, also, could you talk about the UN and the vision for the UN and how that comes to be formed, and how the Soviets finally sort of agree to that at the conference itself?
Mm-hmm. So Roosevelt sees the UN, not just that he wants to have it, he does see it as part of his lasting legacy. He wants to succeed where Woodrow Wilson couldn't at the end of World War I, and practically recognizes that you need some mechanism to keep the Soviet Union as part of the international community after the common enemy of the Nazis is gone. And the way to do this, is through an international organization. The Soviets are very resistant at first. They're very uncooperative. They want to have more influence through their satellite states, kind of one vote for each of the satellite states rather than just one vote for the Soviet Union as a whole. And their argument is that we deserve it because we've sacrificed more than anyone in this war. More of our people have died. We've given more than you have. And so kind of in recognition of that sacrifice, we should be given 16 seats. And Roosevelt and Churchill say no. There's a lot of jockeying also because Churchill kind of can't push back against the Soviets too much because he wants India to also have an independent role in the United Nations, even though they are still part of the British Empire at this point. And then you have the Commonwealth countries, like Canada, which will have a seat at the table. And so the Soviets are kind of pointing at the British Empire and saying, look, how is this any different? And so they are ultimately able to compromise, and the Soviets are given kind of 3 seats, one for Ukraine, one for Belarus, and one for the Soviet Union as a whole. And it's kind of one of those times where there's certain, it's the back and forth of the negotiations where Stalin and Molotov, they can be really kind of hardline about certain things, almost for show, where they don't really care as much. They care much more about things like making sure that the government in Poland is going to be friendly to the interests in Moscow. They've been invaded through the plains of Poland too many times, dating back to the Napoleonic era. And the outlook there is no different than it was during the Tsarist times, that it is imperative that they're in control there. And so I think that in the case of the UN, it's kind of one of these where they are pushing back vociferously, but the amount of pushback isn't necessarily reflective of how much of a priority that they feel it is, like it is for Poland. And so if they're seen willing to compromise on something like the UN, then the Western powers will have to also compromise on something else. And in that case, it's very sadly kind of Poland is the sacrificial party in that, and they're not invited to the conference as their future is being decided, which is also terrible. And so you can kind of see the jockeying through this, the issue of the UN and kind of the political issues that it does cause for Churchill as he's trying to stand up against Stalin and urge Roosevelt to do so as well. And then with Roosevelt's anti-imperialist view working against Churchill. And so it is really one of those moments where it is very tricky diplomacy going on, and not everybody is on the same page by any means.
And a question from our own Ron Meyer. So he mentions Poland looms large. You've already mentioned Kathleen Harriman's interaction with the Polish government in exile. Could you talk about Kathleen's role as a witness at Cotton, which is a very interesting and moving part of your account?
Yes. So there are many benefits that Kathleen finds from being her father's kind of assistant ambassador and the person that he most relies on. And for each of these daughters, it had been kind of a goal since childhood. They wanted to be that person that their fathers relied on in the most important moments. But for Kathleen, sometimes this comes at a cost, and some of it is the realities of the situation in which they find themselves, and other parts of it is kind of because of the relationship they have that's just more like colleagues, where it is kind of less emotionally driven. So while during the time that Averil Harriman was the ambassador to the Soviet Union, it comes to light that there's this discovery of mass graves of Polish officers. They've been murdered in the Houghton forest, and the Nazis and the Soviets are each blaming it on each other. And the Allies, the Western Allies, think that it's probably the Soviets who committed the atrocities, but they're willing to believe, in a sense, that it could have been the Nazis for the sake of keeping the alliance together at this important moment. And so Harriman can't go himself to be the person kind of commenting on, witnessing, and reporting back, because then he'd be kind of speaking officially for the government if he finds something that he doesn't want to find, because it's going to make the relationship tense with his position as the ambassador. That's kind of not an option. So he needs to send someone he trusts. And that person is Kathleen. She had been a journalist. There will be journalists also going with to report on this. And so she's kind of the perfect person, again, in this daughter diplomat role, where she's not officially speaking for the government, but she's the ambassador's daughter, so her words carry weight. And so she has to be the one to go and experience this. And of all the atrocities that she'd seen during the war and the aftermath of the Blitz, and reporting on things like pilots who'd been horribly burned in the Battle of Britain, and she's reporting on their recovery, which is heartbreaking. And it's kind of the first moment that she really comes face to face with the real cruelty of the war. And so she's been prepared for it on some level in that sense, but to actually witness it, and you can see in her letters, she reports on it with almost kind of a certain levity, which is uncomfortable and strange. When you think of it, she's clearly trying to protect herself, and it's kind of a defense mechanism, because it would be just too overwhelming to go on if you really said exactly how you felt about everything. So she has to come back and give her report of what happened. And it's just remarkable to think of being what it'd be like to be 26 and to have that responsibility and see something so horrific. And that's kind of one of the prices that she has to pay as the ambassador's daughter.
So you mentioned in the outset that you were engaging in, the topic in the aftermath of 2014 and what happened in terms of the Ukraine crisis, the annexation of Crimea, this new plummet in relations between, Russia and the West and the United States. What's to fast forward to, where the Institute is now and what we do, and certainly we hope we're still fulfilling, the spirit and the mission of Ambassador Harriman and of course Kathleen. We always sought to sort of serve as a place for rigorous debate and scholarship. And now when we talk about the region, we not only have the Russian perspective, the Soviet perspective, we also have the Ukrainian perspective, and of course the Polish perspective, and so forth. So, I think for us too, it's been a turbulent time, trying to, give, provide sort of informed perspectives from all sides here. I'm curious about the lessons that you take about the current era from studying the past, and whether your own views on, where we are in this kind of U.S.-Russia relationship have evolved as a result of your research.
Yeah, I think, well, one thing, again, going back to the sense of place, which I think is very palpable in this story, you see the Crimea, and it's been at the crossroads of empire for centuries, and will probably continue to be a hot spot for years to come. You've seen, the Crimean War through World War II. It's kind of this place that is just constantly being run over by warring empires, and as those empires evolve, different nations, and the same kind of the reincarnation of the same groups over and over again. And it's kind of like, as soon as the region rebuilds, it just gets destroyed again. And it is really remarkable to resolve the people who live there to continue to rebuild their lives. And you can see that in the story. The daughters have the chance to go out and meet some of the local people whose fates are being decided by their fathers kind of at the conference table, and then come back and report on what they've seen. And this is something that's really important to Sarah Churchill to convey to her father as well. And she finds a lot of hope in the regular people. And so it is kind of this divide between the people on the ground versus the government. And so as the 2014 has shown, it is this place that will continue to be a flashpoint for probably centuries to come. Just kind of the curse of geography. Also, I think from this experience of writing this book, it's kind of emphasized to me that the way that we have sought to deal with the Soviet or Russian leader has been through this attempt to form personal bonds. This is something that Roosevelt was determined to do. He really believed that if Stalin liked him, he would be able to have more of a breakthrough. I think that Stalin probably did like FDR. I think he certainly respected him, especially given that he was paralyzed, but had such respect and love from the American people. Stalin respects strength. Roosevelt projected that, and so he did admire him for it. But at the end of the day, it kind of doesn't really matter. And you can see this great letter from George Kennan writing to Ed Stettinius, who's just become the Secretary of State about 2 months before Yalta. And Stettinius wants to know some background information about the Soviets who will be part of the delegation, as you'd expect. Who are we meeting with? And Kennan writes back and says, I'm really sorry, I can't give you this information. I don't have it, because if the Soviets are saying anything, it's probably fake. The only information that we're getting about people comes through in their obituaries when they're no use to anyone. And even if they did personally like you, it's not going to change the way that they are going to pursue their foreign policy. And so it's just kind of that reckoning that I think Kennan lays out so clearly in 1945 that is just as applicable today. And you've seen subsequent administrations, with the Bush administration, Obama administration, Trump administration, try to form this personal bond with the Russian leader, and it just doesn't work. And so if we've seen repeatedly since 1945 that this is a losing strategy, and you can see how clear that is, especially through the eyes, I think, of Anna Roosevelt and her writing and her father's frustration, and yet this belief that he has that he can make this breakthrough. I think, it should be a real moment of reassessment of how do you proceed and build a relationship when it is not a personal relationship like you would have with a leader of another government. And the other thing that comes through to me, having written this book, is the importance of in-person diplomacy. At this moment, we can't do that. We have had the benefit of the last 100 years where you're able to very easily move around the world and meet with your counterparts face to face. And you can have expedited kind of processes and real bonds forged between people, and where real work can get done. We're not able to do that right now. Hopefully it will resume soon with the vaccine coming. But I think in a place like Russia, where you have this facade, which is really not indicative of what lies just beyond the surface, it's really important to see that for yourself. And for these leaders who are going to the Crimea, they're in the Tsar's summer palace, but it really is just this very, very thin veneer on top of just devastation. And so understanding really what lies beneath the surface, behind kind of the posturing and signaling, especially from something like Russia, I think it just makes it all the more important as we move forward. Yes, we have great tools like Zoom to be able to have these meetings, and it works when you need it. In this situation, I'm glad we have it, but it shouldn't replace in-person diplomacy.
No, that's great. And a couple of things really ring true, because I would say it's not only this periodic fascination with personal chemistry of leaders, which leads to resets, Bush and Gorbachev, right? The original one, then, Clinton and Yeltsin, of course, the Obama reset, Trump and Putin. But I think you're right that there are these sort of structural factors in the background that just go unaddressed. And in fact, they fester even deeper. And we seldomly sort of acknowledge that there are, real kind of structural differences. And the other thing about what you said really struck me is, I think there is an emphasis, even in academic literature, on Putin as a person, as a personality, and that somehow if you were to remove him from the equation, you would have a different Russian foreign policy. You would have a different reaction to what went on in Ukraine. And, that's something I think that's really debatable. And that I think is in line with what you're arguing here. Well, I think we're almost at time here, so I want to really thank you for joining us. Do you have any plans to follow this up with a related project, or are you just sort of out of the book business for the time being?
Well, I mean, I do have to finish law school, so I got to figure out, writing another book around finishing law school. And fortunately, the book has been optioned by Amy Pascal and Sony Pictures for hopefully something coming to the screen.
Oh, terrific!
So
right.
keep the fingers crossed there. And also, I certainly plan to continue writing. I can see the law as informing what I'm able to write about and the kinds of stories I can tell, and also kind of using history to inform the law and the way that we can approach complex problems today, using the tools and the power of knowing history. I certainly have other book projects that are percolating. I have always been really interested in World War II. I don't exclusively want to write about World War II, for the rest of my career, but I will certainly be a theme that I'll return to again and again. And I feel, especially right now, while we still have veterans with us who experienced it, and people, civilians who lived through those moments, that it's important to capture that. So I'm interested in things like possibly something related to World War II in India, which is fascinating. And then also kind of coming back to themes, from the Cold War, there's some secondary figures in this book who I would love to spend more time learning about and writing about, and their careers that extended through the Cold War. So I certainly, would like to, continue kind of in, the modern American European history vein, kind of pursuing from things that are related to this time period, and some of the corners of the world that I think are less explored, but really fascinating, and are able to shed a different perspective on the stories that we think that we know so well.
Yeah, terrific. Well, wishing you all the best with law school and your future projects. The book is The Daughters of Yalta. There are, if you're watching this webinar locally, there are some copies still available at Book Culture, so you can contact them online. And Catherine, thanks so much again for sharing your time with us. Thanks to everyone who tuned in and for your questions here at lunchtime. And we hope we will see you again.
Thank you so much for having me. This is great fun. Really enjoyed it.
Yeah, us too. Thanks.